every country has a sovereign right, whether they are big or small, to make its own security arrangements. That is, but it's the big or small bit that Russia seems to ignore. It seems to be some countries are allowed to choose, some countries aren't. We don't buy into that, and we're therefore here to exercise with our friends and allies to make sure they understand that we are always here to support their freedom to choose.
Welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Post. My guest today is the Right Honorable Ben Wallace, Member of Parliament, who is the Minister of State for Defense for the United Kingdom. Secretary Wallace has been an outspoken leader of the West's efforts to help Ukraine resist Russia's invasion. He recently described Russia's performance in the war as, and I'm quoting here, bad battle preparation, poor operational planning, inadequate equipment and support, and most importantly, corruption and the moral component. Secretary Wallace, thank you for joining us today for a conversation about Ukraine.
Hello, hi.
So let me begin by asking you to comment on what our Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, said in testimony on Tuesday. She spoke of the war in Ukraine as developing into a war of attrition. You said something a little different this week. You said that you thought that Putin, in the long run in this war, has lost. And I want to ask you whether there's any difference of opinion, an assessment between you and our Chief of Intelligence, Avril Haines.
Well, what I was saying about Putin in the long run was actually caveated by saying whatever happens in the Ukrainian war, in the long run, Putin has lost, because he started this before he chose to invade. He started with a Russia of a certain size and reputation and position in the world. And whatever happens, Russia is now lesser, not greater. His armed forces have been exposed as not being invincible. They are currently being worn out, and it'll take years to get them back to where they were. He's predominantly isolated from the West. The level of sort of isolation from big and small countries in Europe and across the Atlantic, United States, Canada, even places like Qatar and South Korea and Australia have been very strident in their opposition. So he is more isolated, lesser country. Russia now facing huge sanctions, punitive sanctions that aren't going to really go away anytime soon. So his economy is going to be lesser, and he is going to potentially spend the rest of his 10 years or however long he stays in power as a more diminished, a leader of a more diminished country. And I think the West should recognize that at one level he has already lost.
On that long run, you just described a 10-year horizon. Our Director of National Intelligence, Haines, said Tuesday that we should be concerned about the mismatch between what Putin wants to do in Ukraine and more broadly in Europe and his capabilities. And she said that she believed we were moving along toward a more unpredictable and potentially escalatory trajectory. I want to ask you whether you agree with that assessment, and more importantly, what you think the West should do if Putin does threaten to escalate.
Well, I think what I would say is I do agree with that assessment, but what I would say is that started long ago. So before the Ukraine invasion, Putin has been on a journey in the last 20 years, and in the last 5 years, I think predominantly encouraged by his ability to fix his own elections and to make sure he is no longer vulnerable. If you remember about 10, 15 years ago, he was always worried about color revolutions and how that would afflict him. I think he's now in a position where he can put that behind him, and now he's focusing on his legacy. And I think he's been on that journey for some time. I was the security minister in the United Kingdom when nerve agent was deployed in Salisbury. We've seen murders in Central Europe. We've seen all sorts of up in the ante by Russia. And I think, so I'd just say he's been on a trajectory that has been escalatory even before he chose to invade Ukraine. And I think one of the important factors in this is that when we're all discussing what to do about this, the opportunity cost of effectively not doing something, allowing him to be successful in Ukraine, would see him on a continued trajectory that I think would have then spilled over into his other areas of ambition, the Baltic states, which he basically claims is still Russia, and he has a claim over those people. His views about the ancient Rus people, that that's a bit of Finland, that's a bit of even the Czech Republic. I think he would carry on that trajectory, taking a calculation that the West weren't prepared to stand up to him, and that his army really was as good as he thought it was. And I think that's why Ukraine has become the buffer for him, as in he's hit the buffers, and again, completely miscalculated. Actually, the international community has come together. I mean, it's been a great success. You'll remember a few years ago, President Macron described NATO as brain dead. Well, that's been proved emphatically wrong. Putin definitely thought we're all weak. We don't really care for our values very much. I think what's been a really positive from this is, the young people across the political divide in the United Kingdom and certainly in Europe, whether they're from the left or the right, they care about their values as much as our grandparents. And I think that's a really a positive part that we've all learned is sort of, as I'm a middle-aged lawmaker, as you'd call us, to see that generation engaged. And I think that's a big miscalculation that Putin is going to have to live with.
Just to be clear, you said something that really caught my ear. You think if Putin isn't stopped in Ukraine, he will move on to the Baltic states, move on to other targets?
Putin always sets out what his ambitions are. He's done it. We shouldn't be surprised. I think there is a question for the West about why did we not act on these things or not take it seriously. But he set out in numerous speeches and essays his view about his ambitions towards Ukraine. He did that in an essay most recently in July 2021. And in that, he evokes a far wider sort of ambition other than just Ukraine. I mean, he talks about the Baltic states. He talks about Balkans and Finland, and in fact, hardly mentions NATO. In I think it's a 19-page essay, he mentions NATO in one paragraph. So, he is true to form. To be honest, many people will say that Putin doesn't lie, and I think at one level his strategic ambition hasn't changed. And I think, if he'd been successful, if he'd proven to himself his calculations were correct, that the Ukrainians did welcome him, that he could roll in his tanks and invade and then occupy Ukraine, I think he would have got more encouragement to himself about, well, now it's my turn to really go after the Baltic states as well, because I'll be proved right that those Russian minorities in those states really want me, and when I turn up, they'll be waving flags, not guns. Well, he got that spectacularly wrong in Ukraine, and that's why I think a lot of their plans have failed, because it was all based on this sort of arrogant assumption.
When Putin and his lieutenants have raised the threat of using nuclear weapons, President Biden has typically responded by saying the United States does not seek a war with Russia. He's underlined our desire to avoid a direct conflict with Russia and to keep this conflict contained within Ukraine. Do you think that U.S. officials have made a mistake in overstressing that theme?
No, I mean, I think one of the reasons the international community is united is we've been all very clear that this is about helping Ukraine defend itself in accordance with international law. It's got a perfect right to do that, and that this is about Putin effectively failing in his ambitions in Ukraine. We've been clear about that. We have not engaged, and we won't be engaging in direct conflict with Russian army or Russian state either. I was very clear in the build-up to this invasion that whether people like it or not, Ukraine was not in NATO, and we were not therefore going to deploy troops on the ground in a combat way at all. So I think President Biden's been absolutely right on that, and we are very careful, all of us in the international community, that we calibrate our lethal aid response to make sure that those type of weapon systems we put in are predominantly tactical and are there to really assist the Ukrainians achieve their goal of defending their own country. I think that's quite an important point for all of us. And every time we decide to respond to a Ukrainian request, all of us think about what that means in that sort of light about is it escalatory, is it tactical, or is it strategic? And those are really important points to make sure that Russia fully understands what we're doing and why we're there.
In that context, Mr. Secretary, your colleague, your Armed Forces Minister serving under you, James Heapy, said 2 weeks ago, got a lot of attention for saying this, that he thought it was completely legitimate for Ukraine to be targeting Russia in depth, that means inside Russia, in order to disrupt logistics, and that it was, again, I'm quoting him, not necessarily a problem if the Ukrainians used British weapons in such attacks. I want to ask you what your view is first about the appropriateness of Ukraine attacking inside Russia. Second, whether you think it's okay for them to use British weapons in doing that.
Well, I think that on the first point, Article 51 of the United Nations allows a country to defend itself. Ukraine is perfectly within its right to take action to defend itself from an invader such as Russia, who is illegally occupying and invading their country. That is international law. Part of that response in defending yourself is not only within your country, but obviously to take steps to weaken the army that is currently invading. So it would be perfectly logical that you as a nation, if you wanted to do that, would have to do something about the supply chains that's feeding the Russian army. So I think no one should be surprised. It's what we do as countries. When we're either aiding other countries around the world, if they ask for our assistance, it is not unheard of that countries will attack their attacker by going further up the supply chain. And I think that's just military logic. Otherwise, you'll stop that. If you don't stop the fuels getting to Russian tanks, or you don't stop ammunition or whatever, then that Russian army can continue to illegally act in that country. So I think that's not a surprise. The United Kingdom's weapons, first of all, we haven't really given them weapons that probably could allow them to do that. We haven't given them helicopters or aircraft or very long range equipment. So it is unlikely British weapons could be used across their border. But we are giving weapons to Ukraine in accordance with the sort of United Nations Article 51, allowing them to defend themselves. And if they used British weapons, French weapons, German, anybody's weapons to achieve that effect, as long as it's in accordance with international law and humanitarian law and Geneva Conventions, then of course, that's something that we recognise as a low possibility because of the type of weapons we provided, but nevertheless a possibility because that was the condition we gave it to the Ukrainians, was to defend themselves.
And not necessarily a problem, as your colleague Mr. Heapy said. So I want to ask you. You said that you think Putin will lose in the long run, but we have a bloody war of attrition, just brutal, as you know better than anyone, going on at present. Do you think there are things that the West can and should be doing to help Ukraine additionally now? In coming weeks to give them a better chance of driving Russian forces out of their country? What specific things do you think should be on the agenda in terms of military supplies?
Well, what we've started doing is effectively shifting from hardware to software insofar as training. When we started this, and the United Kingdom and the United States were providing military, both lethal and non-lethal types into Ukraine before the invasion. But they were predominantly, javelins and, for us, NLAWs, short-range anti-tank, sort of infantry-level capabilities, and they are pretty much point and fire. They weren't particularly complex weapon systems to use. As the international community has decided to step up support, so we've now got longer-range artillery, 155 or 152, which is the existing Soviet type calibers. It's a different weapon system. They need to be more specialist, and so in order to allow them to be used properly and to be used on the right targets, you need to make sure that people are trained. So actually, I think the next step is training to make sure that the Ukrainians, it's not just a question of giving the Ukrainians complex weapon systems. They need to be able to operate them properly. Otherwise, our constituents will quite rightly ask, what are we doing it for? And I want to make sure that the Ukrainians have that ability to do it properly, but also that they can make sure that there is no collateral damage and all the other challenges that we have in war. So I think that's the next big push, is coordinating training to make sure all that weaponry that's been gifted or sold or whatever to the Ukrainians is used properly to allow them to defend their nation.
And what's your view on a question that's arisen over the last several months of giving Ukraine used Soviet-era MiG fighters that would give them a better chance to contest Russia's air supremacy over Ukraine?
Well, I think that's been an example of where we've talked about calibration. I mean, it's been quite a well-aired debate. What would be beyond tactical or even sort of lower level strategy that may or may not provoke a greater response, and is there an alternative way of delivering the same effect? So what Ukraine were really after was the ability to use at long range ground attack. They needed to, the Russians often outranged them at the time with their guns, and the Russians had more air. So how do you affect Russian military forces at range? And you can do that. The conventional way is attack helicopters and ground attack aircraft, but nowadays you can do that with precision munitions, or as we all see, we can do it with armed UAVs. So there were lots of other ways to achieve the same effect that I think we all viewed as not as escalatory. However, I think these are the type of airframes that should be considered if Russia seeks to escalate. I don't think we're talking about the MiG-29s. They're an air-to-air aircraft, and I think what the Ukrainians really want is a ground attack capability. But I think it's absolutely the sort of weapon capability that we take very seriously were we to go in that direction. But for Britain and America, we don't have Soviet or Russian equipment, so to just do that is fairly impossible. I think the position we took in the United Kingdom was, look, we will, if a country does want to do that, we'll stand by them by backfilling, or we'll just defend their right to do that, but that is their choice.
That's a significant comment, I think, that you just made, that if Russia does escalate, one thing that the West, the United Kingdom included, would consider is providing these aircraft, which so far we've held back from providing.
I just need to clarify that, David. We don't have any of aircraft that we could provide. And what I'm trying to make the point about is what we've done already is that if President Putin does something escalatory, such as bombing civilian areas, as he did a few weeks ago, and start to destroy towns, I took the decision that the right type of response to that was to make it even harder for him to do his job in Ukraine. And that's why Britain took a decision to provide short-range anti-air defense, because it was, you bomb civilian areas, this is now going to be much harder for you to do. And we will use a calibrated response. It wasn't long range, but nevertheless, it now makes it harder for him to fly in that area. And I think all the responses need to be calibrated. Doesn't necessarily mean, therefore, it would be fixed-wing aircraft if he decided to escalate. But I think he should understand that if he escalates, there will be a response.
Thank you for clarifying that. I have a couple of questions from our viewers that I want to put to you. Nancy from Canada asks, how seriously do you take Putin's nuclear saber rattling?
Well, I think we should always take threats from President Putin seriously. I mean, he is a individual who resorts to all sorts of uses of weapons, as we saw. I use the example of nerve agent on the streets of Britain. But we obviously have ways to monitor readiness and the capabilities of the Russian nuclear arsenal in the same way they try and monitor ours. We see what he said. He invokes it recently. He's invoked it at a number of occasions, as has Foreign Minister Lavrov. But as yet, we don't see a real change in their posture. Of course, we take it seriously, but I think he knows, because he often talks about it in speeches, that NATO together, 30 nations, both conventionally and nuclear capability, outmatches him. So I don't think he is going to be picking a fight with nuclear weapons, and no one wants that, and we are all very clear with him in that space. But it's in the Soviet doctrine, it's in the Russian doctrine. Tactical nuclear weapons, they've always believed they can be used on a battlefield, whereas many of us in the West think it's a sort of completely odd thing to be doing. Nuclear weapons are strategic, in my view, by their very nature, but it's always been in their doctrine.
We have another audience question. Jim, also from Canada, asks, what do you think of Putin's end goal now? How does he end this without losing face?
I think that's one of the hardest questions, because every time you think he could find a way to sort of claim the victory, he then goes and does something that makes it even harder. Threatening Finland and Sweden, as we've seen him do. I think only last week, I think they put up posters in Moscow of Swedes either dressed as Nazis or comparing them to Nazis. I mean, all that does is get the opposite effect of what he wants, which is less NATO. So I think it's quite hard to work out what is his off ramp, and that's you'll hear lots of people talk about off ramp. I think what he needs to understand is that a lot of this is of his own making, and it's quite hard for us to sit here and tell the Ukrainians that they should have an off ramp when they are suffering at the hands of this aggression. It is perfectly possible for him to stop, to try and seek some sort of victory in his own mind, and come to a negotiation table with proper negotiation positions that respects the sovereignty of Ukraine. I think on the other side, to reassure your listeners, I think it's quite important that what the West does is not dictate to Ukraine how it chooses to exit this war. If the Ukrainians want to come to a table and make a deal, that is entirely for the Ukrainian. We're all doing this to help Ukraine, as your clip opened earlier said, to have the freedom to choose. What they do with that choice is actually a matter for Ukraine, and we shouldn't be dictating terms. I think our ambition for Ukraine, and I think Russia will understand this, is to allow Ukraine to negotiate from a position of strength, not with a gun at their head.
So, as you said, this war has not gone well for Putin in terms of his expectations. I'm curious what evidence your government has found of dissension within the ranks, within the Russian military, within Putin's inner circle. To put it bluntly, do you think Defense Minister Shoigu or even Chief of Staff Gerasimov will end up being fall guys for these mistakes, or other people will be sacked?
I think a lot of people will be sacked. I think if you look at history, the Russian armed forces are notorious at turning in on themselves. Plus, you've got the FSB and the SVR, the two sort of quote unquote civilianized intelligence agencies who will no doubt be looking to blame everybody else for it. And I think that is one of the characteristics of this invasion is there is no candor upwards. There is no truth upwards. And when you get a system that doesn't tell the truth, it becomes, we see the mistakes that get made, and the cost is the poor old soldier at the bottom who is ultimately turned into cannon fodder while people preserve their own sort of egos and office. And I think that is very likely to happen, and it has been happening. We've seen in open media's reports about an FSB general, I think, being put under house arrest. We've seen, other signs. We see the generals going to the front line, which is a sure sign that they can't actually get their soldiers to do as they want them to do, and that's why there's been a high casualty rate. So, look, the nature of history shows that the Russian system, or sometimes the Soviet system, will turn in on itself. Any regime that is run by fear always sees people, look to their self-preservation at the expense of someone next to them or in the office above them or below them. So I think we're going to see more of that. Who actually finally gets the blame, whether it's Gerasimov or Shoigu, I suspect you'll be able to, it'll be more than a few will get blamed.
So your government announced something significant this week in offering a security pact for Sweden and Finland on their way to what's expected to be their admission to NATO. I want to just clarify what that means. That sounds to me like you're offering, in this transition period, a nuclear umbrella if they should be attacked.
Well, I think, I met with my Swedish counterpart about 6 months ago, and we talked about the close links to Sweden and Britain. Sweden is a big European country insofar as big in culture and presence and history. Britain and Sweden and Scandinavia are very close. We have a 10-nation military sort of grouping called the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is all the Nordic countries plus Holland and Britain. We exercise a lot together, we train together, and within that 10 were two non-NATO countries, Finland and Sweden. So this was actually not really originally to do with them joining NATO. It was a recognition that as President Putin was getting more dangerous, that Britain would reassure people like Sweden and Finland that, we are such deep in our history that it is inconceivable that we would not come to their aid should they be attacked, either sub-threshold with cyber or other issues, or if militarily. Now, how would we respond? I'm not going to speculate. Our whole posture on nuclear deterrence is always deliberate ambiguity. That's how Britain does its deterrence. But look, we would definitely come to the aid militarily if that was the right thing to do with the Swedes or the Finns as well, and because it's just inconceivable we wouldn't.
We have time for just two more questions. One, and we could talk for an hour about this, but I'd ask you to just give a short answer. General Petraeus famously was asked others in Iraq in April 2003 during the invasion, "Tell me how this ends." So I want to ask you that question about Ukraine. How does this end? Does this end with Putin getting sacked? Does this end with basically a change of regime in Russia? Does it end with their military defeat? What's your quick summary of how this story ends?
I wish I knew. I mean, I think you could see two types of scenarios that your viewers would recognize. You could have a Korean ending where you have a frozen conflict that lasts for another 50 years, where North and South Korea, as we see today, has been separate and effectively behind a wire for very many years and frozen. You also have the Vietnam conflict, which for different reasons saw an overwhelmingly large, technically advanced force have to give up its ambitions and its abilities by the Vietnamese, and the United States, 15 years, as we know, the losses and the political appetite changed, and the rest is history, so to speak. So I think you've really got, in some scenario, really two main scenarios. Is this going to become a Korean frozen conflict, or is it going to become a sort of Vietnam? And there's a lot of similarities. The United States didn't have home advantage. The Vietnamese population, well, Russia doesn't have a home advantage. It doesn't, of course, Putin doesn't have the political sensitivities about seeming to care for his soldiers. So, that's a big difference. But I think what you could certainly see is a Russian army that is, and I think, as was pointed out by the administration the other day, slowing down to some form of stalemate where the Russian army becomes exhausted, or their equipment running out. I mean, we know they're running out of precision weapons. You only have so many cruise missiles, and once you've fired them all and fired what you've got, you don't have many left. They take months, if not years, to replace. You start to run out of that. Those soldiers, people forget, they've been in the field for 3 months before they even went in to invade, with a group of soldiers not well prepared, not well trained, often without knowledge. I think you can get to a stage where the Russian army is just exhausted, worn out, and President Putin has to come to some form of negotiation. And I think that's why it's really important that Ukraine is in a position of strength. But I don't know how it's going to end. I think the sadness of all of this, and there is a great sadness, I don't like suffering, whether it's Russian or Ukrainians, is that from presidents to prime ministers, they warned Putin not to do this. They asked him not to do it. They implored him not to do it. They pointed out he'd get more NATO, not less. They pointed out lessons of history, and they didn't want to listen. And it's quite hard to save someone from themselves.
So helpful answer. Let me ask a final question about politics. And I'm going to cite my regular read, the Daily Express in London. Daily Express headline 4 days ago: Boris, meaning your Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, will not be in charge. Defense Secretary Ben Wallace is the people's favorite to replace Boris Johnson as the new Conservative leader and Prime Minister. They were citing a poll that Express had done. I want to ask you what you make of that polling, and if your colleagues in the Tory party selected you as party leader, would you serve?
Well, first of all, the first thing I know about that poll is what you read out. I'm so uninterested in a pitch for leadership. I'm incredibly fortunate to do a job that I know something about, but I love doing, and at a time there's nothing more important in keeping people strong and safe and our society and standing up for our values. I am one of the privileged people who gets to actually action our beliefs, which is to try and defend those people that can't be defended themselves. And to stand up for us. And there's a lot of people out there who want to do more to help Ukraine. I get to do that. So the idea that I would be interested in leadership, I doubt it. I doubt I want to be prime minister, but I am a politician. So, you can read that answer as you like, but fundamentally, the prime minister has been an excellent prime minister to me. He's incredibly supportive. He allows me to be a defense secretary and run the department. And, when you become a secretary of state, you couldn't really wish for any more. So I'm not even interested. I'm interested in delivering defense.
So I want to thank Secretary of State for Defense Ben Wallace for a fascinating conversation about Ukraine. A little bit of politics here at the end. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you come back.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
So please come back to us here at Washington Post Live for our other programming. To find out what we've got coming ahead, go to WashingtonPostLive.com. I'm David Ignatius. Thank you for joining us for this wonderful discussion with Britain's Ben Wallace.